Chapter 43, Survival Priorities. Tumble bobbed like a cork. The water was thick with lily pads, and it was deep enough that she couldn't find the ground beneath her feet. Move, she thought. Move fast. She kicked hard, trying to get out of the way of whatever was coming, because there had to be something. Whatever the swampish version of a curtain-eating dog or an exploding road flare was, it was bound to happen. She'd get tangled up in lily pads and drown. Or a snake would bite her on the ankle, and Blue would have to suck the venom out with his mouth, and then their friendship would never be the same because gross. She kicked toward the boat. Blue! She shouted. Blue, are you all right? Blue had been thrown forward by the impact, but he recovered quickly. Don't come this way, he shouted. We're stuck on a tree or something. Tumble stopped swimming, a few feet from the boat. Blue was right. The water under the boat was probably full of sharp, broken limbs. The last thing they needed was for her to be a shish kebabbed in the middle of the swamp, with no way to call an ambulance. But, can you turn the motor back on? Can you reverse? Blue was staring down at Goat's boat. Blue? I don't think I should try, he said at last. Well, you've got to. We've got an alligator to find. Tumble, the boat. A mounting suspicion made Tumble's words come out high and nervous. What's wrong? The boat is just a little bit broken. Blue was using what Maximal Star would have called an unalarming voice. Tumble was alarmed anyway. Blue, is there a hole in the boat? Kind of. Kind of? Yes, said Blue. Yes, there's a hole in the boat. Are we sinking? We're sinking. Blue! But really slowly, he said. They stared at each other for a long moment. We're going to have to spend the night treading water in a swamp, thought Tumble. We're going to die in a swamp trying to find a magic alligator, thought Blue. The moon had reappeared overhead. It grinned bloodily down at them. Tumble saw Blue pick up her backpack and put it on the bench in front of him to keep dry. My phone's in there, she realized. She was still bobbing, just out of reach. Her fingers were getting pruny. Try to call someone. They would be in so much trouble, but anything was better than floating here all night. You know we're not going to have a signal. So you're not even going to try? We're stuck in a swamp with a sinking boat. Okay, Blue sighed, but there's not going to be a signal. He found Tumble's phone in the front pouch of the backpack. She saw the blue-white glow of the screen light up his face. Work, she thought. Please work. No reception, Blue said. Okay, Tumble tried to breathe deeply. Okay, so what are we going to do? I guess we have to swim, Blue said. And then we walk back to the creek? Tumble was sure they could make it to land. They were surrounded by it, and it would be easy enough with a life jacket. But she wasn't certain about getting all the way back to the creek. And once they got there, how far would they have to walk to get back to Goat's? That sounds like a great plan, she said in the most upbeat tone she could manage. Blue tried to keep his fingers from shaking as he rummaged through Tumble's backpack. He found a bottle of water, a pocket knife, and a package of trail mix. His new flashlight was supposed to be waterproof, so he tied its strap around one of his belt loops and hoped for the best. He zipped the remaining supplies back into the pack and put it in the driest part of the boat he could find. Getting into the water was tricky. He dropped the knife while he was easing himself out of the boat, and he only managed to hold on to the trail mix because he was clenching the bag between his teeth. But he had bigger problems to worry about. There were sharp limbs in the water, and Blue didn't want them to scratch his legs. Blood might attract alligators, and even if it didn't, he'd probably get some kind of swamp infection. When he finally made it into the water, which was cool, but not cold, all he could think about was the fact that he had not come prepared for swimming. His running shoes were weirdly buoyant on his feet, and the flashlight pulled at his shorts under the water. He paddled cautiously toward Tumble, one arm wrapped around the supplies. She was fighting her way out of the life jacket. Don't do that, Blue said. He ended up with a mouthful of water. We need to share it, said Tumble. No, we don't, he sputtered. You can't even keep your head above water. Blue had been planning on letting her carry the supplies since she had the jacket, but by the time he reached her, she had flattened it out on the water in front of her like a float. "This isn't how you're supposed to use them," said Blue, reaching for the jacket. Tumble snorted. "You're also not supposed to steal people's boats or drown in swamps. I think we're just going to have to ignore a few more rules tonight." She tied one of the jacket straps around the water bottle, but they ended up throwing the trail mix away. "It's not like one package is going to do us any good if we're stuck out here," she pointed out. "Survival is all about priorities." They each kept a hand on half of the jacket to help them stay afloat as they kicked back the way they had come. Tumble kept looking over her shoulder. Blue knew that the moon's reflection was still there, glistening red on the water. "What if we were really close?" she said. Blue, who had been thinking that reptiles probably loved hiding under lily pads, didn't know what she meant at first. Then he caught the longing in her voice. "No," he said. "No way." "Blue." "Absolutely not," said Blue. "I'm tired. My bug spray's washing off, and I've inhaled at least 3 mosquitoes. We have 1 water bottle and no food. And we've got no way to get back home before people realize we've been gone, unless we're extremely lucky." He paused. "And Tumble, we're never lucky." "I know that," said Tumble. "But maybe that means we don't have anything left to lose." "Except our lives." "Now you're just being melodramatic. We'll be okay. I know how to build a campfire and everything." Blue glared at her. "Fine," she grumbled. "We'll keep going." They kicked away from the moonlight, toward home, and all of the things that were wrong there. "But Blue," Tumble said, "what if we were really, really close?" "Tumble, no! We are not turning this life jacket around." Chapter 44, Upside Down. "You're a bad influence," Blue said as they kicked steadily toward the moon's reflection. "And you're going to get us both eaten." Tumble snorted. She was too breathless to laugh outright, but Blue heard her anyway. "I don't think you should be allowed to giggle when you're swimming toward your death." Tumble snorted again. "I'm laughing in the face of danger." "Has that ever gone well for you?" She decided not to answer that. They had agreed not to swim so far that they couldn't see the boat anymore. At first, it had been difficult to keep their pace the same, and the life jacket had jerked to and fro as they swam, but they were finally falling into a rhythm. Tumble was a little worried about how tired her legs were getting. It wasn't like swimming in a pool where you spend half the time standing up in the shallow end. They swam past a cypress tree, and the moon's reflection shifted farther to the left. Blue was glancing back over his shoulder again. Tumble knew the dark outline of the boat must be almost invisible. "We won't go much further," she panted. "I promise, but we'll never forgive ourselves if we don't do everything we can." They swam on. Later, when they tried to describe what had happened, Tumble and Blue would never be able to recapture the strangeness of the moment. They were swimming toward the moon's reflection. Something, she hoped it was only a lily pad stem, was wrapped around Tumble's leg, and she was kicking extra hard with that foot to knock it off. Blue was trying to hold the life jacket steady. Neither of them was paying as much attention as they should have been when the world turned upside down. It happened all at once. Suddenly, they were underwater. Their hands were still gripping the life jacket, which was somehow below them in the water, and their feet were still kicking, but above them. They were swimming down. Before Tumble could panic, before Blue could yell, the world flipped up again, and they were jetting in another direction. Up, up. In an instant, Tumble's head and the life jacket broke the surface with a splash. Blue came up beside her, sputtering and reaching for one of the jacket's straps. "What happened?" Tumble shouted. "How did we get pulled under?" Blue shouted back. They clung to the life jacket together, their hearts pounding, their lungs demanding reassuring gulps of air. Then they looked around. They were still in the swamp, but nowhere near where they had been. Tumble and Blue were floating in a lake, bordered all around with tall grass. The water was deeper here. Even Blue's long legs couldn't reach the bottom before his head went under. And in front of them, 100 or so yards away, was an island. It was a small hummock of land rising above the still water, covered with tall pines and tupelos that stood out like inky columns in the darkness. A strip of muck and weeds ran along the side facing Tumble and Blue, and that narrow bank was covered with a writhing mass of scales. Alligators. Dozens of them. They were lying there, row upon row, so that their dark prehistoric hides obscured most of the ground. And in their midst, bigger than any of the others, was an alligator whose armor shone a burnished gold, even in the red moon's dim light. Chapter 45, Underwater. "Munch," Tumble whispered. "Don't move." Blue wasn't going to move, or speak, or think loud thoughts. They held onto their life jacket, staring hard at Munch. He looked like a giant statue more than anything. No real alligator could be that big. It was difficult to make out the finer details in the darkness, but Blue thought his eyes were closed. They had to be closed. Munch was sleeping, he told himself, and he was going to keep sleeping, and they were not going to be gator bait. The moon was smiling right over the alligator's gleaming head, closer and bigger than it should have been, as if it wanted to remind them that this was what they had been looking for. This was their answer. Blue hadn't expected the answer to appear so deadly. He stared into Tumble's eyes, trying to communicate silently. "I don't know what to do," said her eyes. "We've made a terrible mistake," said his, and she didn't disagree. Each of them was waiting for the other's decision. A sudden, tremendous splash shattered the silence, and 20 yards away, between them and the island, a silver canoe rose out of the water. It was upside down, water sheeting from its sides, and someone was clinging to it with one arm. The stranger struggled for a moment before he managed to flip the canoe. Then he brought his other arm up out of the water. He was holding a paddle. He tossed it into the canoe, and it hit the metal seat with a bong, so loud Blue could feel it in the water around him. He stared at the alligators. They didn't seem to care about the clamor the newcomer was causing. The stranger's face was covered by his wet hair, but he must have been able to see well enough because when he turned his head and spotted Munch, he had the same reaction as Tumble and Blue. He went still, for one breath, two. Then he dove under the water. Blue stared at the place where he had disappeared. What was he doing? He couldn't hide under water for long. When the stranger's head finally popped up, he was farther away from them, closer to the island. He was swimming right toward Munch. "Blue," said Tumble, panic stretching her voice thin. "Blue, he's going to beat us." Blue looked at the moon. He looked at the man swimming away from them, diving under again. He looked at the gators and Tumble and all of it. This is a race, he realized, and they were losing. Tumble and Blue flailed with the life jacket for a couple of seconds before they both realized at the same time that they would be faster on their own. Tumble launched herself forward, and Blue went under water. He swept his arms in the smooth arcs he used so many times to cross hotel pools. He couldn't see under the water, so he caught what was happening around him in flashes when he came up for air. Tumble was right in front of him for a while, and the man was a few yards ahead of them both. Then Blue went under. He kicked hard, swept his arms, and came up to find he'd passed Tumble. He went under again and moved forward through the water until his lungs hurt. When he broke the surface, he saw that he was gaining on the stranger, who didn't seem to realize yet that he was being followed. He went under, came up. He was still gaining. But I can't win. He could hear the deep thrum of Tumble's splashing legs and arms whenever he was underwater. She could win, possibly. Only she wasn't a fast enough swimmer. Blue thought of a new plan. He would catch up to the stranger, and he would grab onto him. Somehow, he would slow him down just enough for Tumble to pull ahead. He could do that much. He swam as hard as he ever had. Every time he went under the water, he pushed through it with all his might. He kicked until his sneakers slipped off and his legs throbbed. He surfaced for just long enough to gasp air, then went back down, not even checking to see how close he was getting to the other swimmer. He couldn't afford to waste the time. Not until he was sure he was almost there. When he thought he must be near his goal, he finally took a moment to look. It was hard to focus his vision. Lights were wriggling in front of his eyes, and he had a stitch in his side that tugged him with every desperate breath. The island was so close. Blue could see the crimson gleam reflecting in Munch's eyes. The alligator definitely wasn't sleeping. Was the stranger under water? He must be almost to the shore. The thought filled Blue with a final rush of adrenaline. I can't lose. Not again. Not this time. He ducked his head and surged under the water as swiftly as if he had been fitted with propellers. Tumble was doing the perfect overhand stroke she'd practiced after reading about the time Maximal Star saved the crew of a yacht in Tahiti. But in the dark, with so few landmarks, she was having a hard time swimming in a straight line. When she realized she was off course, she started looking up more frequently to get her bearings. That was how she saw everything. The stranger and Blue were both under the surface when the golden alligator let out a booming bellow that echoed off the black water. Tumble didn't speak gator, but she knew a battle cry when she heard one. The alligators reacted in an instant to their master's call. They slid into the water as one, an army of teeth and scales, and Tumble realized with horror that they must be aiming for the nearest intruder. The stranger's head popped up a few seconds later, but the alligators were already out of sight. He didn't know what was coming for him. Tumble screamed. She was too out of breath for a good long one, and she didn't even bother with words. She just screamed and gasped and screamed and gasped and slapped the water with both of her arms, trying to make as much sound as possible. The stranger turned around. Tumble took a deep breath. "The alligators!" she cried. "They're in the water!" Whoever he was, he didn't need to be told twice. He started swimming toward her, arm over arm, water flying up around him as he flailed. Tumble treaded water, thinking fast. Blue was still under the water, but the stranger was making more noise, so maybe Blue was safe. Okay, she hoped Blue was safe. Lines from How to Hero Every Day were running through her brain, but none of them told her what to do about an impending alligator attack. Maximal Star had never dealt with one. All Tumble could think was that if she was going to battle with something that swam, she needed to get out of the water. The canoe. Tumble hated to do it, knowing the alligators were out there, but she took a deep breath and went underwater. She wanted to swim quietly, not loud like the stranger. And I can hold my breath for a long time now. She was up to 79 seconds. If she got pulled under by strong jaws, that was how long she would have before she... Swim, Tumble, swim! Her heart was trying to escape through her ribs. She kicked with everything she had left. When she surfaced, gasping, she was only a yard away from the canoe. It was floating low. She stroked toward it and saw that it was half full of water. Tumble threw her arm and leg over the edge, bashing her knee hard against the metal side as she did. She tried to pull herself up, but the canoe tipped toward her, and more water flooded in. No. Tumble tried again. The wooden paddle slid out and splashed into the water beside her. Tumble stopped. Her muscles were burning and her arms were shaking. She wasn't going to be able to get into the canoe by herself. She looked around for anything that might help and saw the life jacket drifting nearby. She kicked for it, dragging the wooden paddle behind her with one hand. Suddenly, everything that floated seemed important. By the time she managed to struggle into the jacket, the stranger had reached her. "Where are they?" "The alligators." He was wild-eyed and breathing even harder than Tumble, and he had strips of white medical tape across the bridge of his recently broken nose. "Howard? Tumble?" he shouted. "What are you doing out here?" "What are you doing out here? Blue and I saw the moon and we wanted—" "Blue?" Howard whipped his arms, spinning around in the water to look for his cousin. "Blue! Where is he?" Tumble saw him. He was at the island. He was climbing out of the water. He's all right, she thought. Blue's okay. Relief warmed her for all of a second. Then Howard disappeared under the water. Chapter 46, Meeting. Blue crawled onto the island, hands scrambling at the weeds and roots along the bank to pull himself up. He'd lost his shoes during his swim and one of his socks. He was hot, trembling, and lightheaded, but he made it onto his feet. He stumbled forward, ready to grab... Where had the stranger gone? Blue had to stop him before reaching Munch. He felt the failure closing in on him. It was wretched, familiar sensation. He'd tried. He'd given everything, but he still wasn't good enough. Then he looked to his left. He saw the alligator. It was the old story come to life, only it was more than a story ever could be. Glowing and golden, the alligator watched him through split-pupilled eyes. The smile on its snout was wickeder than the moon above. Tumble didn't think. There wasn't time. Howard had gone down. Something, possibly one of the alligators, had dragged him under. She gripped the boat paddle in both hands and stabbed it into the water as hard as she could, aiming for the spot where Blue's cousin had disappeared. If I hit him, so what? She thought. So what? He's going to die. And maybe she would hit the alligator that had him instead. She stabbed and stabbed until her arms screamed for her to stop. Then she felt the paddle strike something fleshy and solid. She didn't know if it was human or reptile or some other awful swamp monster, but she did know, right down to the bottom of her soul, that Howard Montgomery would rather be brained with a boat paddle than eaten alive. So she jabbed the paddle down again as hard as she could. Some massive force under the water ripped it away from her. Tumble's wrist twisted, but she didn't even feel it. There, just under the surface, was a pale hand, reaching for her help. Tumble reached back. Howard came up, coughing and spitting water. "Are you hurt?" Tumble shouted in his face. She was still holding his hand in both of hers. He grabbed for the shoulder of her life jacket. She went under for an instant, and then bobbed back up as he let her go. She spat out a mouthful of water. "I said, are you hurt?" "I don't know," Howard cried. Tumble didn't believe a person could not know if his legs had been gnawed off. "Can you move your legs?" "Why are you yelling at me?" Tumble paused. She hadn't realized that she was. She took a few deep breaths. "If you can move your legs, we need to get to the canoe." She spoke in the calmest voice she could manage, which wasn't very. Howard seemed confused. "Swim that way," Tumble commanded, pointing. It was 3 kicks to the canoe, and then Howard held the boat still while Tumble rolled into it with a splash. Tumble didn't think he would be able to get in, too. He was too heavy, and she was too small to balance the canoe while he climbed aboard. She yanked at the ties on her life jacket and pulled it over her head. "Take it," she said, waving it over the side of the boat at Howard. "Put it on, and stop flailing around so much. You'll attract more alligators." Howard's eyes were still bugging out of his head in a way that made Tumble doubt his ability to follow instructions. "Put the jacket over your head," she said. "It will make you float." Howard splashed a lot more than Tumble would have liked, but he managed to get the jacket on. He blinked up at her. "You saved me." Tumble heard the words, but at first they didn't make sense. She looked down at herself, safe in the boat, and at Howard, alive and wearing the life jacket, for now. There was a sploosh, and Tumble saw the wooden paddle popping to the surface a couple of feet from the boat. Part of its handle was missing. She clenched her jaw. "We're not out of danger yet," she said. "But if you do exactly what I say, we will be soon." Blue looked around, searching. An impossible realization was dawning on him. Nobody else was here. It was just him and Munch. Blue was first. What he felt then was magic. It was a happy, stunning sizzle. Somehow he had made it to the island before anyone else. He, Blue Montgomery, had won. Unfortunately, his elation was brief. From the water behind him, he heard splashing and Tumble's voice screaming. He whirled and spotted her, so much farther away than she should have been. She was slapping her arms up and down, sending up gouts of water that shone red in the moonlight. "The alligators!" she yelled. But Blue looked around quickly. All of the alligators that had been lying on the muddy bank with Munch were gone. He squinted into the trees, trying to see if they were hiding in the underbush, waiting to lunge out if he drew near. The splashing behind him grew louder. A horrible thought struck like lightning. Was Tumble being attacked? "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that," said a deep drawl of a voice. It was as slick as oil, and it was right beside him. "She's hardly a mouthful, that one, and the congregation wouldn't dare eat anyone tonight. Tonight's mine, after all." Blue turned, slow and careful, as you had to be with a predator. The alligator wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was a man, too tall by half, and dressed all in dark gold scales. He had slit-pupiled eyes to match. "Hello, Blue Montgomery," Munch said, stretching his mouth to show teeth like ice picks. "I've been waiting ever so long to meet you."